Welcome, everyone. I know that some are filling into the room as we speak, but we are only here for an hour, so we do want to get started. Good morning to those in the US, good evening to those in Asia, and good afternoon or anything else, everyone in between. I'm Jenny Town. I am a senior fellow here at the Stimson Center and director of our Korea program. And we are going to be talking today about the impeachment that has been upheld in South Korea and sort of the meaning of that on the way forward. And of course, the world has been watching South Korean politics more closely than usual these days. President Yoon Suk Yeol declared martial law on December 3rd last year for the first time in South Korean history since 1979. He originally based the decree on extreme political opposition and anti-state activities as causing a state of emergency. And although this was short-lived, his conditions under martial law prohibited all political activities, including functioning of the National Assembly and local legislatures, strikes and protests, and suspending free press, all while he sought to arrest various political leaders, especially among the opposition party. So Koreans haven't seen this kind of authoritarianism in a while, but certainly they had memories of this and they sprung to action quickly, overturning martial law within hours. And 2 weeks later, Yoon was both impeached and charged with criminal charges of insurrection. But this really left the country in extended political limbo. And so finally, one part of that story has come to resolution with the Constitutional Court delivering a unanimous vote last Friday that the former president's actions were unconstitutional, upholding the impeachment and formally removing Yoon from office. This has now led to a snap presidential election, which is set for June 3rd. And so while the chapter on impeachment closes, it does not necessarily mean smooth sailing for Korean politics going forward, especially with rising domestic support for Yoon, hyper-partisan politics at play, growing suspicions over the country's election integrity, and really amid rocky relations with the US over tariffs and military burden sharing, as well as North Korea's continued WMD demonstrations and developments. So we've gathered some of our top experts here to help walk us through some of the issues that lie ahead and the broader foreign policy, regional relations, implications for Korea in the near to midterm future. With us today is Rachel Min-young Lee. She's a senior fellow in our Korea program in 38 North. She spent nearly 2 decades as a Korea collection expert and analyst with Open Source Enterprise, focusing on North and South Korean issues. Most recently, she led engagement and network building efforts at Open Nuclear Network. Frank Januzzi is currently the president and CEO of the Mike and Maureen Mansfield Foundation. He previously served as the Deputy Executive Director of Advocacy, Policy, and Research at Amnesty International. And he spent over a decade at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as Policy Director for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, has a long history in and out of government focused on East Asia, especially Korea and Japan. And Yoon Sun, our Senior Fellow and Director of the China program here at Stimson, who's actually joining us from China this evening. And her expertise is in Chinese foreign policy, US-China relations, and China's relations with its neighboring countries and authoritarian regimes. She has a long history in the policy space, having worked at Brookings Institute as well as the International Crisis Group. So we have a wealth of knowledge here. We're really looking forward to the discussion. For those of you in our audience, feel free at any time to pose questions using the Q&A function. And with that, I'd like to ask each of you to present some opening thoughts for about 5 minutes, and then we'll delve into the discussion. So Rachel, why don't I start with you?
Thank you, Jenny, for the great overview and the introductions. I was personally pleasantly surprised to see South Korea shifting so quickly from impeachment to the upcoming election. This, of course, is not to say that South Korea has been healed, and far from it, the nation remains deeply divided and hurt. But I think at least it seems to be moving on and looking forward and not backward. In a way, we're all forced into looking forward and not backward because the moment the court upheld the National Assembly's impeachment of Yoon on April 4th, we have all been plunged into an election season. Han Duck-soo officially announced June 3 as the snap election date. This is in accordance with the Constitution, which mandates an election within 60 days of a constitutional court ruling to impeach the sitting president. In terms of the prospects of the upcoming election, the conservative ruling party, or the PPP, will face a formidable uphill battle. First, it's the connection with an impeached president. And second, the party remains divided in the wake of Yoon's impeachment. 60 days may not be enough time to close this divide and unify the party around a single viable candidate. The PPP is in disarray, and it shows. Multiple PPP members have already thrown their hats in the ring, or they're expected to, but there are no clear frontrunners. According to most recent public polls, Labor Minister Kim Moon-soo leads the pack, with former leader of the PPP Han Dong-hoon and Daegu Mayor Hong Jun-pyo being two other favorites. However, the greater part of the poll respondents do not really have a clear favorite in the PPP. The landscape looks much more straightforward in the main opposition party, the Progressive Democratic Party. Lee Jae-myung, who is the former leader of the DP and the DP's presidential candidate in 2022, is the clear favorite. According to a most recent poll, 44% of the respondents picked Lee as the most suitable presidential candidate in the Democratic Party. The other candidates do not even come anywhere close to that number, although a number of people will be running in the primaries. South Korea's foreign policy will inevitably undergo changes, irrespective of who wins the election. It is merely a question of how deep and wide those changes are. Yoon's impeachment almost gives the legitimacy and even perhaps the mandate to the next president to undo many of his legacies. On the foreign policy front, those key legacies include a clear pivot to the U.S. and further strengthening of the U.S.-ROK alliance, strengthening of ROK-Japan relations, and strong support for U.S.-ROK-Japan trilateral cooperation, and of course, South Korea's first ever Indo-Pacific strategy, and a strong stance against North Korea. Should the conservative PPP win the election, the next administration will largely stay the course, particularly with regard to the U.S.-ROK alliance and North Korea. However, it may become more forward-leaning on China than Yoon was, depending on how its relationship with the U.S. evolves, for example, tariff and defense cost-sharing negotiations, or if South Korea becomes marginalized as the Trump administration starts engaging Kim Jong-un, as is the fear in many circles in South Korea. China, South Korea, and Japan last year started taking steps already to resume high-level dialogues and step up cooperation. And in recent days, the trade ministers of these three countries discussed closely cooperating on trade issues. So it'll be interesting to see how this trilateral cooperation evolves as U.S. Foreign policy evolves in the region as well. On Japan, even if the Conservative Party wins the upcoming election, Yoon's successor will be less inclined to step up cooperation with Japan at the level that the Yoon government did. We can expect, obviously, greater changes in foreign policy if the opposition party wins. The alliance with the U.S. will remain important, but it will not enjoy the same level of importance than it did under Yoon. A progressive administration will likely attempt to maintain strategic ambiguity between the U.S. and China, just like former President Moon Jae-in. We can expect less emphasis on South Korea-Japan cooperation, which inevitably will affect the trilateral cooperation among the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. We may see some type of diplomatic overtures toward North Korea, especially once the Trump administration begins to engage Pyongyang. A progressive administration likely will also be less aligned with the broader U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. And of course, one lingering question, of course, is whether South Korea's nuclear debate. And I'm happy to pick up on this and other points during the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. A lot to think about there as we move forward. Before we get into the discussion, though, Frank, why don't we turn to you?
Thanks so much, Jenny, and thank you, Rachel and Yoon Sun. Rachel's remarks dovetail nicely into the theme I was asked to discuss, which is sort of to dive in a bit on the Japan ROK implications of the impeachment and the upcoming election. But before I do that, let me just touch briefly on a connected issue, which is sort of identity politics. To telescope out a little bit, both Korea and the United States are deeply divided political communities today. And in South Korea, I understand that division to owe its origins really back to the Korean War, and even before that to colonial Japanese administration. And there are competing narratives about which political wing in Korea truly reflects the identity and the integrity of Korean nationhood and sovereignty. And you have the conservatives who see themselves as the descendants of the safeguarders of the Korean nation against communism. And you have the Democrats who see themselves as the origin of democratic Korea, opposition to dictatorship, and have always had a view toward China that was less in the mode of condemnation and more in the mode of big neighbor, need to work with them, especially because we want to unify the country eventually. We need their help. So there's deeply divided competition here about who is the legitimate sort of speaker on behalf of Korean national identity. And this translates into the foreign policy realm, right? And so the conservatives, which align themselves more with the United States and the anti-communist struggle, and even the dictatorships of the past, are more likely to view the Japanese ROK US triangle favorably, as Rachel indicated, whereas the Democrats traditionally have been more skeptical. My point is that's changing. China's bad behavior is driving a convergence of opinion among progressives and conservatives in South Korea with respect to foreign policy. For the Democrats, for the Minsu-dang, China's bad behavior, North Korea's nuclear threat, and an unstable world is underscoring the value of the U.S. ROK alliance, which the progressives have sometimes treated with skepticism. It has also underscored the value of making common ground with Japan, which for all of its troubled history with the Korean Peninsula, nonetheless represents a force largely aligned with Korea on the global stage in terms of liberal democratic order and the rules-based international system that has helped Korea to prosper. And similarly for the conservatives, the changes in world events, including in this case the election of President Trump, actually sort of underscores the importance of having more balance in South Korea's foreign policy. So perhaps more willing to talk to China or engage with China in a strange way in defense of the liberal democratic order, which certain elements of the Trump administration's foreign policy might challenge. I believe that the conservatives and the progressives in Korea are being pushed a little closer together by world events. And therefore, I am more optimistic than I used to be about overall continuity in South Korean foreign policy, no matter who wins in June. Assuming for the moment that Lee Jae-myung will be likely the candidate, he has said some rather important things recently about Japan. In February, he was quoted that he was not hostile to Japanese military buildup. And that he was, as a lawyer earlier in his life, moved by his visits to Japan, where he experienced. And similarly, in late February, Lee Jae-myung congratulated President Trump. And in that congratulatory message, he specifically mentioned the U.S. ROK Japan triangle as something that had value. And I think this is providing some reassurance to Japanese voices with whom I've spoken, who are frankly nervous about the Minsu-dang worried that they may take a big step away from the spirit of Camp David, and worried that Japan would be left sort of more isolated than ever, not only isolated potentially from a common interest in Seoul, but also potentially abandoned by Washington if the United States continues to sort of cast some doubts upon the value and its commitment to alliance relationships. So as I look forward at the June elections, I am reminded that it was the Biden administration more than anyone in Seoul or Tokyo who drove the Camp David process forward. So on the one hand, we have to ask ourselves, do we expect that the Trump administration will sustain that level of effort on behalf of the Triangle? It's a mixed signal we're getting from DC. Marco Rubio met early in his tenure as Secretary of State with the foreign ministers of Korea and Japan. He reaffirmed the importance of the spirit of Camp David. He spoke movingly about the criticality of this triangular relationship in a world that is threatened by a rising China. But I do not know the extent to which the president shares his Secretary of State's commitment to that triangle. But on the part of Japan and Korea, I see reason for cautious optimism that although the nature of the relationship will surely be affected should the Democrats prevail in the presidential election in June, I do not think that South Korea is going to back away in any wholesale way from the efforts being made to deepen cooperation with Japan, especially because in the world that is emerging, they are reminded of their like-minded status as committed to the liberal democratic order, committed to open and free trade, and committed to preserving security and peace in Northeast Asia. So let me stop there with sort of a cautious message of reassurance and calm in the face of political uncertainty in South Korea, that at least with respect to the U.S. ROK Japan triangle, I think that it's likely to be sustained.
We like a little optimism these days. It's hard to come by, but and just a reminder again to the audience, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box at any time, and we will definitely get to them. Next, Yoon, we'd love to hear more of the Chinese perspective of what's going on and what they expect of this political resolution now in moving forward in Korea.
Thank you, Jenny. It's really an honor to be on this panel with Rachel and with Frank. So I'm currently in China, and I was also here in late March. I think at the current moment, the development in South Korea, in South Korean politics, is really not a priority, right? It's really not the topic of the day because the trade wars, the escalation of the tariff, the back and forth with President Trump, that's sucking the oxygen, all of the oxygen out of the room, and everything else is regarded as secondary. So despite this major development in South Korean politics, I wouldn't say that this, at the very moment, is Beijing's priority. I think there's also another reason that why we're not seeing too much of a reaction from China towards this announced the impeachment of President Yoon, which is the next stage will be the election, right? The election is set for June 3rd, which means that there is going to be another 2 months before the dust of the South Korean politics will settle. So I think before the Chinese can be sure about the result of that election, I think it's very unlikely for them to come out to make comments in the event that they are seeing or they're regarded as biased or trying to sway the South Korean politics in either direction. I think the Chinese are quite allergic to the perception that China is interfering in the electoral politics in South Korea, and they understand that whatever they say, whether it's is in favor of the progressives or in any other way, it could lead things to a direction that is not necessarily not necessarily in China's interest. So I think the Chinese have tried very hard to remain not even neutral. I think they're trying to remain quiet on the comments about the South Korean politics moving forward. But if you discuss with Chinese analysts about the potential result of that election, I think there is a very clear recognition that the conservative government under President Yoon has not been the most amicable or most positive towards China. And the what Frank just mentioned, U.S., Japan, ROK, trilateral cooperation has been seen as a development that is in the opposite direction of Northeast Asia as China would like to see it. Some of the Chinese have called it Northeast Asian NATO, because they see the emergence of a U.S.-led trilateral, maybe not trilateral alliance, but at least a trilateral cooperation mechanism that eventually is targeted at China. That's the Chinese perception. So in their view, I think there is a strong interest in seeing the progressives to win in the election. I don't disagree with what Frank said about the continuity. I agree completely. I think there's going to be a significant amount of continuity in South Korea, even if the progressives win the upcoming election. And I also agree that I don't think there's going to be a wholesale reversal of South Korea foreign policy under President Yoon. However, from the Chinese perspective, the issue of alignment or alliances, more alignment, is never black or white one. It's never binary, right? In terms of China's relationship with whether it's Japan or South Korea, there's quite a bit of similarity. It's about the degrees. It's about to what extent China could shape their policy in a more China-friendly or more China-neutral position. So I don't think the Chinese bears the illusion that either South Korea or Japan would abandon their alliances with the United States and instead seek security architectural security arrangement with China. But if there are ways that they can convince either Seoul or Tokyo to be more neutral or more balanced in their position between U.S. and China, that is already seen as a victory. And I think the Chinese eventually are working towards the direction that these two countries will become more neutral. Not that they will stop being U.S. allies, but they will think about balancing diplomacy more than just without even thinking that by default aligns with the United States, regardless of the issue. So I think that's a Chinese agenda, and we're seeing that, for example, last year they had the trilateral summit in South Korea, and this year Rachel mentioned that the trade ministers of the three countries had a meeting in late March. Actually, before the trade ministers meeting, they also had a meeting among the three foreign ministers. So I think that's the direction that the Chinese are pushing for, not a wholesale change of their policy, but a gradual balancing or rebalancing, if you will. And of course, there are plenty of uncertainties associated with South Korea's foreign policy outlook. I think U.S. policy is going to be a quite significant factor driving or at least influencing the direction that they will pursue. And another related factor is North Korea, because I think the speculation in town is that at some point President Trump will pick up North Korea agenda and try to seek some opportunities, whether it is opportunity for engagement or something else, that he will not forget about North Korea. So that potentially is also going to affect how South Korea will respond and how South Korea calibrates its relationship with the United States and with China. Because if you recall, during the last round of the engagement, during the first Trump administration, at first, I think South Korea was very gladly hoping to be in the driver's seat and hopefully to play the interlocutor role between United States and North Korea. I would love to hear Rachel's assessment of how South Korea eventually concluded about the last round of U.S.-North Korea engagement. But one could argue that that there are some dissatisfactions or some reluctance on the South Korean side to acknowledge that engagement was fully aligned with South Korea wanted to see. So these are the uncertainties, but as things fold, I'm sure we'll see more changes and more evolution of events down the road. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Yoon. And we do have a number of questions coming in, again, to the audience. Feel free to type them into the Q&A box as we go along. I want to pick up where Yoon sort of left off and talk a little bit about North Korea. So as China as Yoon described China as being quiet at the issue right now, we also see North Korea being quiet about the impeachment process itself. And maybe, Rachel, if we could turn to you and really ask, what do you think the North Koreans are thinking about what's happening in South Korea right now? How much do you think they actually care? Or is it just, again, an issue that's very low on their priority list as they go through their 5-year plan, the last year of their 5-year plan?
I think it's a legitimate question to ask, right? Like, how much does North Korea care about who the next South Korean president is? North Korea's response or reaction to this whole entire impeachment process has been quite muted compared to the 2016-2017 period when then President Park Geun-hye was going through an impeachment process. Back then, every single day we were getting commentaries and statements from different organizations and news reports about the impeachment, the rallies. This time, periodical updates here and there, but really overall very muted. And I think it goes in line with Kim Jong-un's two-state policy, regarding South Korea as a separate state. My reading is that North Korea doesn't care as much about who the next South Korean president is, because I think at the end of the day, North Korea's goal is to exclude South Korea from all nuclear negotiations or any diplomacy with the US going forward. In the past, North Korea had more interest, I think, a vested interest in who the next president in South Korea was, because, it's easier, obviously, to work with a progressive party candidate or a president from the Progressive Party. But if North Korea is excluding South Korea, does it really care that much as it used to?
I want to bring in the kind of elephant in the room here these days when it comes to US policy and how this might be affecting, how it might affect the South Korean elections, how it might be affecting the way South Korea, Japan, and China are all viewing the future. And that is Russia. And Trump's treatment of Putin, of the way he's approaching trying to settle the war, but also really the repair of, or the attempts to try and repair and normalize US-Russia relations, with the notion that, we know that Trump wants to at some point also restart dialogue with the North Koreans. And so I think there's a lot of reason for concern about a very different world order in the near-term future. And I wonder if each of you could really kind of give some thoughts on how you think South Korea, Japan, China are viewing this situation, how it might be affecting, their choices going forward. And again, in that moment where you might have rapprochement between US, Russia, US, North Korea, where does that leave China, South Korea, Japan relations in that process? And so a lot of big questions there. Feel free to kind of pick out the parts you want to respond to. But maybe, Frank, why don't we start with you?
Sure, briefly, because it's a really critical question, Jenny. And here I think I need to distinguish between the Trump administration and President Trump, because the Trump administration is generally hawkish on China, as is the US Congress on a bipartisan basis, as are any segments of American society, whether it's the business sector, which is tired of being ripped off with their technology, or ordinary consumers who might complain about displacement of jobs, or human rights advocates who are worried about China's illiberal system. But the president himself, while imposing these massive tariffs on China, I think deep down has a certain respect for Xi Jinping as a strong leader, and I think is interested downstream, maybe in Trump season 2 instead of Trump season 1, in a G2 grand bargain with China. Similarly, the president himself is very much favorably disposed toward President Putin of Russia, while many in his administration, but not all, are more skeptical. So what you're setting up here potentially is a US-Japan ROK triangle, which was affirmed in the face of Russian aggression against Ukraine and a common response of sanctions and tariffs and penalties against Russia. It was affirmed in the context of a sort of a bullying big China posing various kinds of threats or intimidation toward their neighbors in the East China Sea and Taiwan, and even economic retaliation against South Korea for deploying THAAD. You see the opportunity for a real shift where President Trump might embark on high-level bilateral summit diplomacy with Putin and Xi Jinping, and essentially leave South Korea and Japan stranded, having aligned themselves closely with US efforts to both contain a potentially aggressive China and respond to a demonstrably aggressive Russia. South Korea and Japan may find themselves faced with a situation where President Trump is lifting tariffs on China while keeping them in place on Japan and South Korea, or normalizing relations with Russia while having asked Japan and South Korea to curtail all of their economic activities, with Russia. So there's a threat of a real breach in sort of alignment and trust is one that I think we need to think strongly about. And I think that people in Seoul and Tokyo are already nervous about it. I mean, you can see them looking around, wondering what they can do, but there's not an obvious plan B for them.
Yoon, maybe we can turn to you.
There's been a lot of discussion about reverse Nixon, about U.S. trying to improve relationship with Russia in order to reverse the directions of the strategic triangle, and this has been quite popular a proposition in Washington. I'm not sure the Chinese see it that way. Well, they have some concerns about the speed of U.S.-Russia rapprochement and what it would mean. But I think after they have seen how the ceasefire talks for the Ukraine war has dragged on, and how Russia has basically used the negotiation to quote to string President Trump along, I think the Chinese are a little bit more confident about the directionality of U.S.-Russia relations and also Sino-Russia relations. Because if you look at the China-Russia relations, a lot of the infrastructure is already in place and cannot be easily moved or removed. Just give you one example, if you look at the energy trade, China has been, I believe, about 19.6% of China's crude oil import last year came from Russia. It was a very significant amount. Even if some of the sanctions are being lifted on Russia, the international oil market and energy market remains to be a buyer's market. So the Chinese are relatively confident that the Russians will not be able to shift significantly what they currently sell to China to another customer very easily. So there are some internal logic or internal dynamics that anchors China-Russia relations. In terms of the Russian role in U.S. DPRK relations, I think the assessment is that Russia cannot solve the fundamental issues between U.S. and North Korea either, right? So China is not able to solve that. The Chinese have said repeatedly that the bilateral issue or the security issue between U.S. and DPRK, that's not a topic for multilateral conversation. Denuclearization is a multilateral topic, but the strategic, the security or the lack of security, the security issue between U.S. and DPRK, that's not an issue that can be resolved by an external party. It can be resolved by China. It cannot be resolved by Russia. So, and if you look at Iran, currently there is a U.S.-Iran negotiation going or dialogue going in Oman. Russia has offered to provide assistance on the Iran nuclear negotiation to the United States. But even that, I don't see that the fundamental security issues between U.S. and Iran will be very quickly resolved simply because Russia offers to play a role, right? So you have to ask that to what extent does Russia's involvement really changes or fundamentally changes the dynamic between U.S. and DPRK? My answer is it doesn't change the fundamentals. It probably will facilitate or assist with the mechanics or the communications channel. Maybe Russia could even play the role of a messenger or interlocutor, not even a broker, definitely not a broker, and very unlikely to be a mediator. But the fundamental issues between U.S. and DPRK, that's still a bilateral problem that needs to be resolved by these two parties. Thanks.
Great. And Rachel, let's turn to you.
I agree with what Yoon just said about how Russia could play the role of a facilitator or a mediator, depending on how U.S.-Russia relations proceed, in terms of trying to get the U.S. and North Korea, back to the same table, or, just being that, middleman. But I don't know that Moscow can fundamentally play a more fundamental role beyond that. As I'm listening to our conversation today, I'm thinking more and more how big of a variable U.S. foreign policy has become in everything that we're discussing today. South Korea's relations with the U.S., of course, China, Japan, so much of that hinges on the Trump administration's posture and position and policies in the region. How committed the Trump administration remains to South Korea's defense, and in the region, of course, the nuclear deterrence, all of that really, is important, right? Because then it leads to the other questions of, where South Korea may be going with the nuclear debate. There's a lot of talk right now in South Korea about, even acquiring nuclear latency, or should we go beyond that? Can South Korea go beyond that? Will the Trump administration make some kind of an exception for South Korea, where South Korea can go nuclear or acquire nuclear latency without facing all of the negative repercussions of pursuing that capability. So at the end of the day, so much really hinges on, I think, the Trump administration's policy towards South Korea and in the region writ large. And I think, the biggest fear, I mentioned this briefly, one of the biggest fears that South Korea feels right now is the possibility of South Korea being marginalized or even excluded as the Trump administration reaches out to Kim Jong-un and begins that process of resuming diplomacy with Pyongyang. That's one of the biggest fears. And, if that happens and South Korea does not get to have a say in whatever deal the Trump administration may want to make with Kim Jong-un or ends up making with Kim Jong-un, then I think that again is going to, really bring to the fore that whole nuclear debate in South Korea.
Well, great. I think there's lots of questions coming in the Q&A, and I want to get to them. And I think the first one we'll start with takes us back to kind of the beginning of the conversation, and really refocus on South Korea and the election process. And so there are questions about, and Rachel, I'll pose these to you as well. Why was Yoon able to gain support back so quickly? How far right has the PPP moved because of that? How does the move to the right impact its popularity, do you think, going forward into the next election? And I'll add a question to that as well, about, in past elections, foreign policy was not a central pillar to deciding the election. Do you think it will play a bigger role in this election, given what's going on in U.S. ROK relations and inter-Korean relations?
Thanks, Jenny, for summarizing those questions. How was Yoon able to regain support during or in the aftermath of his enactment of martial law? That was surprising to me as well. I did not expect the conservatives to unite in that way and with such force in the wake of the martial law enactment. Of course, the initial reaction from everyone was shock. But, in the days that followed, it was amazing to see the level of support and the unity within the conservative camp. And I don't think that many people foresaw that. So that was surprising to me. And I think Yoon was clever in his messaging. I think he brought out some themes that resonated with a lot of the conservatives, playing to the anti-China sentiment, and stoking fears about, what might be wrong with the election system, the possibility of the integrity of our elections, of South Korea's elections being questioned. All of that, I think, resonated with some of the fears that have long been with the conservatives. So I think he played that pretty well, that card. And also whether the PPP has really moved to the far right as a result of what happened with Yoon and the enactment of the martial law, the impeachment. I think on the whole, no. I would say that maybe the far right members that you see in the PPP are maybe on the fringes. I would say that still the core of the PPP base is they're conservative, definitely, but I wouldn't call them far right. I think we're talking about a relatively small percentage, when you look at the whole picture. And, it's important to note, and the PPP knows this better than anyone, well, all of South Korean politicians right now as we enter the election season, is that the centrists, right, getting the moderates votes will be critical. Right, getting the younger generation's votes will be very critical. They'll be the swing voters. Even back in 2022, the moderates, the undecided voters, right? The centrists, like those votes were very important, and they were the deciding, the casting vote, basically. So I think this is part of the reason why, and it remains so today. And I think this is one of the reasons why Lee Jae-myung, for example, is trying to moderate the tone. When you compare his public messaging these days to some of the things that he has said in the past, you may notice a difference in his approach to many of the policies. He's taking a more moderate tone and moderate approach to many of the policy issues. And it is because of that reason precisely that he wants to go after the swing votes, which tend to be the undecided voters, the centrists. They're not conservative. They don't identify themselves as conservative or progressive. They're really more about the issues, like the issues of the day, how they feel about the issues. So So I think, yeah, so that would be my question to the second one. And in terms of the importance of foreign policy for deciding votes, I still tend to think that foreign policy as a whole doesn't figure largely into South Korean voters' minds. And that would be my answer.
Okay, great. Yoon, I want to turn to you. One of the questions that came in, you had mentioned that China will focus on encouraging Korea and Japan to become more neutral. So gradual rebalancing towards China. The question is, for this, what can China offer more of? They've already offered Korea and Japan with visa exemptions for tourists. What more do you think China could do, might want to do in terms of building incentives for Seoul and Tokyo to come closer to Beijing?
If I recall correctly, in terms of China's trade in 2024, Korea and Japan, as well as Taiwan, are the few entities that actually run a trade surplus vis-a-vis China, which is pretty hard because China had a total of $1 trillion of trade surplus against the whole world last year. So I would say that suggests that there are opportunities and there are space in China's trading relationship with both Korea and Japan in order to enhance potentially China's import of goods from these two countries. And I think this is particularly appealing in light or in the context of the tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed on all countries. Well, we know today that China is faced with 104% tariff from the United States now, and the China counter retaliated with its own tariff of cumulatively on the U.S. good now is 84%. And the Trump administration's the most recently announced tariff on Japan is 24%, and on South Korea, I think it's 25%. So these tariffs are going to have their impact, right? And one has to wonder whether this potentially will add to the momentum for intra-regional trade rather than inter-regional trade. And I think potentially that could offer space for China to advance their trade relationships with both South Korea and Japan. The FTA negotiation or the FTA discussion, trilateral FTA has resumed, but I wouldn't say it has picked up speed. There are innate obstacles that the three countries will have to resolve, like for example on digital trade and on government procurements. I think those are the more difficult issues that needs to be ironed out. But in terms of trade in goods, I think there are more consensus as for where the negotiation could go. So I would say that if you look at the size of the Chinese economy and the current external environment, I would say that trade potentially is that issue. Also, this doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? I think in China's relationship with these two countries, their relationship with the United States plays a very important role because I think the Chinese are calculating that is U.S. doing more damage to their relationship with to U.S. relationship with these two countries, because that could potentially make China a little bit more appealing and make the Chinese offer a little bit more attractive. So these are not static calculations that this is what China will do. I think what China will do also depends on what U.S. is willing to do or what the U.S. refuses to do. Thanks.
Thanks, Yoon. Frank, I know you want to jump in here too.
Just briefly, because I think Yoon Sun has put her finger on a very important issue here, which is that, typically elections are driven by domestic issues. Let's face it, the economy, apartment prices, job opportunities, these are the main drivers in the past of South Korean and American and Japanese elections. But in this case, the intersection of foreign policy, especially tariffs, and economic performance and outlook is very vivid. And so I don't anticipate that the election in June is going to be a foreign policy election. I don't think it's going to be driven, by attitudes about Japan or China or Ukraine or even about sort of international security issues such as, should South Korea develop a more latent nuclear capacity or develop an independent nuclear deterrent. But I do think that the tariffs and the economic resolution of that one way or another could have a very major impact. And as Yoon Suk is suggesting, there is an opportunity here for China, potentially with Japan and Korea, to exploit ill feelings between the U.S. and its allies as a result of the tariff policy. So I think we should watch that space. Because for the moment, China's holding firm and retaliating against the United States. They seem, Xi Jinping seems engaged to pursue a high stakes confrontation with the United States. I believe because he anticipates ultimately that Trump will cave and come running to Beijing to cut a G2 deal. But in the meantime, this strong Chinese stance against the U.S. tariffs opens up the opportunity for China to pursue a conciliatory courtship with South Korea and Japan, which could have significant implications long term for sort of the economic policies of Japan and South Korea vis-a-vis the United States and China, and could be an issue in the upcoming election. Do South Koreans prefer a South Korean president who will somehow mollify Trump and find a way to get South Korea out from under sanctions? Or do South Korean voters prefer a president who will stand up to Trump and perhaps pursue a hedging strategy or exploit opportunities with the EU and China and Japan even to compensate for losses in the US-ROK bilateral economic relationship?
So, Rachel, I want to turn to you to respond to what Frank and Yoon have said, but to add another dimension to this. And of course, one of the ways in which Yoon has gained support in this time from martial law, from the impeachment to the decision, is really building this narrative and leaning into the narrative of election tampering and Chinese influence over election tampering, and really fueling a lot of anti-China sentiment. And so while this is a time of opportunity for China to try and rebuild relations with Korea and Japan, how much do you think this anti-China sentiment is going to play into limiting kind of the options that the next president in South Korea will have?
That's a very good question. I mean, anti-China sentiment has always been there, right? And going back to 2017 with the whole THAAD, deployment and the actions that China took, I think that really, had an impact on how South Koreans view China. I don't know. It's hard to say. I don't think that what happened, all of the issues that you brought up, about election tampering, Chinese influence, I don't know that that's going to have too much impact on the general South Korean public, who is not part of the, far right fringes that we talked about. For them, I think it basically reinforces that notion. But I think for the rest of the public, especially the centrists, the undecided voters, that I talked about, and they will be the swing voters, right, in this election. I don't know that they would necessarily buy into that. And going forward, like South Korea's China policy going forward, if we see a significant surge in anti-China sentiment in South Korea, obviously it could have some, pose some limitations to how South Korea deals with China. But I would also argue that South Korea's anti-China sentiment has always been high. So I don't know that that's going to be the decisive factor in South Korea's China policy. And again, I think the more decisive factor here in regards to Seoul's policy toward Beijing really is going to be, it's South Korea's relationship with the U.S. going forward.
Great. So one question poses, while the fundamental issues between the US and DPRK are unlikely to be meaningfully mediated by Russia and China for now, as we were talking about before, a scenario involving the end of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, followed by China's likely decisive and irreversible move to annex Taiwan, there's a lot of assumptions here, could force significant policy shifts in the Republic of Korea. In such a context, are the conservative and progressive political forces in South Korea likely to adopt similar positions? Will these moves bring the left and the right closer together on security and foreign policy? Yeah, a lot of assumptions here, a lot of what ifs. And Rachel, if you want to tackle that.
I keep coming back to this, but I think a lot of South Korea's foreign policy moves will hinge on how its relationship with the US evolves, the negotiations on tariffs, the defense cost sharing, of course, how South Korea is treated during the Trump administration's courting of North Korea, or its approach or a re-engagement with North Korea. How South Korea perceives U.S. Commitment to nuclear deterrence, how it perceives that to be. I think it hinges on all of those things, more so than anything. This is where maybe I differ a little bit with Frank, what Frank said earlier in his opening comments about the convergence of foreign policies of the PPP, the conservatives in South Korea, and the progressives. I think at the core, there are those fundamental differences that exist. And of course, with the, the changes in the external environment, such as how South Korea's relationship with the US evolves, there may be some convergence depending again on how the US-RK alliance evolves, how all of these negotiations with the US proceed. But at the core, I think that there are some stark differences between the PPP and the DP in foreign policy that I don't think will quite well go away.
Yoon, I want to give you a chance to just reflect on all the assumptions here in terms of, do you think there is any correlation between how the war in Russia-Ukraine ends and China's thinking about Taiwan?
Well, that's a question, because a very popular question, because people have been contemplating, assessing what China's lesson learned from the Ukraine war since the day one of the Ukraine war, right? What is China's takeaway? And if the Ukraine war indeed ends with Russia being the winner, and Russia getting away with basically the invasion of another sovereign country, annexation of the territory of another nation without much cause, I think it's natural to assume that the Chinese will see this as a potential model that in the end you're going to get away with it. I think that will put a lot of pressure on U.S. allies and also U.S. partners, whom will be asked to support the U.S. Position in that potential event of Taiwan contingency. But I do agree with you. I think there's a lot of assumptions embedded in that question. I don't necessarily see China's approach to Taiwan or China's eventual decision on Taiwan is going to be driven by external events. And the Ukraine war is one of those external events. I think China's policy has its own logic, has its own timetable, and has its own pace, if you will, in terms of what will be done at what time. So in that sense, I don't think the ending of the Ukraine war is necessarily going to drive a Chinese decision to invade Taiwan or not. I think that's essentially still going to be a US-China question, what is the level of U.S. commitment and what is the potentiality of U.S. military intervention and how far U.S. is willing to go. Because remember, as in the policy, in many people's observation, there is a speculation that President Trump does not want a war. And he's unwilling to get involved in a war. He sees himself as a peacemaker, and he's trying to mediate the ending of the Ukraine war and also the Gaza crisis. So I think if you take those into consideration, I don't necessarily see the ending of the Ukraine war is going to be a determining factor in China's future decisions regarding Taiwan.
Well,
Jenny, I know time is short, but
Yeah.
if I may, just very briefly, I agree with Yoon Sun and Rachel on these 2 points. With respect to the timing of any heightened tension between China and Taiwan, I think it's quite independent from anything going on in Ukraine. And I think the main takeaway from the Ukraine war and how it ultimately is resolved will be China's either coming to more affirm that the United States is serious about fulfilling security commitments to friends and allies, or that the United States is willing at times to jettison the interests of friends and allies in pursuit of an America First agenda. And that is a lesson that China will take forward into the future for years to come, and they will sort of put it in the back of their brains. This is an America that may not fight or really stand up for Taiwan. But with respect to foreign policy, I agree with Rachel that there are some, maybe not irreconcilable differences, but some very fundamental differences between the Democrats and the conservatives in South Korea. And Taiwan might be one of those because the conservatives, Yoon, came a long way toward where the U.S. has been on Taiwan under President Yoon with their Indo-Pacific strategy and explicitly mentioning peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait as a national security concern for the Republic of Korea. And I think the progressives are going to be much less willing to ever go there and view the Taiwan-China issue as really, internal to China and China-Taiwan's future, and not a matter on which the South Korean people and government really should weigh in explicitly or in their security policy. So that's one of many differences I think that remain, despite what I do see as some trend lines towards some convergence on foreign policy.
Yeah, and I do think that, when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war, I think the bigger questions is what is North Korea learning from it? And, especially if there is a settlement to the war that favors Russia's position over Ukraine's, how is that going to shape South Korea's thinking about, what Trump might define as peace in a Korean War settlement? And so I think that that's a topic for another day, though. Our time is up. I do want to thank our speakers for a really engaging discussion. It is the first of many as we go into this election cycle in South Korea. And so we do hope the audience enjoyed it and that they will join us for a few